Hey y'all, we're going to talk a little bit in more detail here about the lymphatic system and the lymphatic anatomy. We've already talked about lymphocytes, so you have some sense of lymphocytes and the defense system, but we haven't talked specifically about lymphatic anatomy, and I want to do that. Now, I guess the best way to begin this is by talking about filtration. You know that vessels create filtration, and filtration is the term we use for the fluid that escapes the vascular system and goes into surrounding tissue. Now, in the capillary bed, this is a good thing. When you're injured, this filtration is increased to flush out and deliver defensive cells to fight off potential pathogens. Okay, so that's all good. In general, though, there's a certain amount of filtration, a certain amount of fluid that escapes the vessels and goes into surrounding tissue. It's at about the rate of 20 or so liters a day. In other words, every day about 20 liters of fluid escapes your vessels into surrounding tissue. And about 17 to 18 of those liters is reabsorbed by the vascular system. So in other words, you get a flushing out of the vascular system that's reabsorbed in the vascular system. That is the fluid that's traveling through your capillary beds. That's keeping you healthy. That's providing proteins and defensive cells and all the things you need to the capillary bed, phagocytes and whatever else. All good. Except, if you look at those numbers, about 10% of the filtration isn't returned to the vessels. And a reasonable question would be, what happens to that? It's got to go somewhere. It can't just stay in those tissues, or you would just get like puffier and puffier and puffier as you get more and more inflammation in all parts of your body as that filtration just built up, fluid built up in all parts of your body. What happens is that that extra filtrate actually gets absorbed by the lymphatic system. See, wherever you have vessels, you also have lymph vessels. And wherever you have capillary beds, you also have lymphatic capillaries. And the lymphatic capillary is a separate pathway of vessels that absorb lymphatic fluid. And lymphatic fluid, don't let it confuse you, it's just extracellular fluid. It's just the fluid from your blood that seeps through the vessel walls and gets into the surrounding tissue. So fluid is fluid, right? Some of that goes back into the vessels. Most of that, 90% of that goes back into the vessels. 10% of that gets absorbed by lymphatic capillaries and drawn into what are sometimes called lymphatic veins, but that can be confusing, so I'll call them lymphatic vessels. The reasonable question is, why? Okay. These lymphatic vessels are there for several reasons. One is obviously to return that loose filtrate. That is to say, the blood vessels aren't absorbing all the filtrate. We can't let it build up in tissue all around your body. You'd be like a massive water balloon. That's not going to work for you. So one of the major purposes of the lymphatic vessels is to return filtrate back into circulation. But another reason is to capture excess valuable components, like let's say proteins, and return those to circulation. That is to say, your vessels are leaking, and most of what's coming out there is fluid and small particles. Proteins are big. Remember, they're big, long, sticky things. So they don't get out very much, but every now and then one hits a opening in your vessel wall just right, and it sneaks out. But proteins are complex molecules. They take a lot of energy for your body to make. You don't want to lose those. So the lymphatic system allows those to be returned to circulation. That's important. But the real reason that the lymphatic system is there is to enable lymphatic defense, to basically absorb that extra filtrate and bring it through a system that exposes it to lymphocytes and allows it to be cleaned of potential pathogens or debris, cellular debris, broken bits and pieces of red blood cells, or whatever else, including viruses, bacteria, etc., and then returned back to circulation. So your lymphatic system is a fundamental part of your defense system. Now, you might be familiar with lymph nodes. You might know where they are. You might have gotten a cold or some other illness, and you had big swollen nodes right here, or maybe in the back of your neck or somewhere else in your body, you had a big swollen lump. That's a lymph node. Here's an image of how that works. Can you see all those lymph vessels throughout your body? Again, wherever there are vascular vessels, wherever there are blood vessels, there are also lymph vessels. And they are absorbing that extracellular fluid and bringing it back to what we call nodes. And the nodes are basically just concentrated kidney bean shaped tissue that have in them phagocytes, neutrophils, and other defensive cells that are going to help clean up anything that's in there and shouldn't be in there. So they function kind of like a filter. They're filled with a lot of different tissue, but the tissue is principally like a reticular tissue, which is our way of saying it's kind of like a fibrous filtering tissue. So you can think of them as a mechanical filter. So basically you're going to have things go through there, and the undesirable stuff is going to be cleaned up and eaten up. In addition to that, inside of each one of those lymph nodes, the ones in your throat, and there's others, and they tend to be, by the way, before I get on to what's in them, they tend to be in places where your inside and your outside meet. We talked about this before, right? Because we talked about mucous tissue and where that is. So where do your inside and your outside meet? Well, when you breathe and eat, stuff that was outside goes inside, and guess what? There's a lot of nodes around there. The ones you're familiar with here, but there's some in the back. Your tonsils are lymph nodes, and you've got several different tonsils that basically surround your airway and esophagus. And then you've got lymph nodes in your gastrointestinal system that take care of any problems in anything that you ingest, anything you eat. And you've got lymph nodes, hundreds of them, in other parts of your body that basically are there to protect you and to clean the lymphatic system and return that clean fluid back to circulation. Okay, so they're all over your body, as you can see from that image. There's lymphatic ducts that then will reconnect that back with your veins. These lymph nodes, again, kidney-shaped things that basically act as filters. And inside of them also, importantly, are lymph nodules. And a lymph nodule, you can imagine as like a cluster of a few hundred different lymphocytes. Remember what the lymphocytes are? Yeah, the defensive cells. Clustered together. And what's happening is they're regenerating. This is where these lymphocytes are being created, being reproduced. And on the outside of that ball of the hundreds of lymphocytes all clustered together, some are sloughing off, and those are going into your circulation system. Those are the ones that are going to be there as part of your defensive system. So here's an image of what a lymph nodule looks like. So that is an image of a lymph node. And in that lymph node, you can see the lymph nodule. The lymph nodule are the hundreds of cells clustered together. I don't know how to picture that. Picture that like a few hundred golf balls all glued together. And some of the golf balls on the outside are breaking off. That is basically the reproductive process. On the inside is the reproduction of these lymphocytes, and then on the outside are those lymphocytes that are functional, that are now breaking off and going into your circulatory system. And so in these lymph nodes is where that cleaning up process takes place. Now suddenly, the fact that your lymph nodes got swollen when you were sick or had an infection makes sense. Because what was happening is your lymphatic system was taking all those bad things you had, the bacteria you had, delivering it to the lymph nodes, and the lymph nodes had phagocytes in them that were eating it all up and dealing with it, and as a result of that, they got swollen, they got big, aggressively trying to deal with this. And if you had a really bad infection, then maybe those lymph nodules took such a hit that, or lymph nodes, excuse me, took such a hit that they didn't quite go back to normal. In other words, they developed some scar tissue. So maybe, I don't know, the back of your head or somewhere, you've got a bit of a knot that you've had ever since you had that really bad illness, and it hasn't quite got back to normal because it's sort of got a little bit of scar tissue built up in there. But basically what we've got then, if we follow the system, is we've got a bit of extracellular fluid that doesn't return to the circulatory system. It goes into lymph vessels. That gets carried in the same way that veins carry it, with valves, through passive constriction back to lymph nodes. Those lymph nodes have in them lymphocytes, phagocytes as well, that are going to eat up any kind of injurious agent in there. And then the process will continue, and it'll bring those back into your circulatory system through designated passageways. So where are those lymph nodes again? Well, here's an image that reminds you. You can see all the lymph nodes there right around your airway, and that makes sense. Right around your mouth makes sense because that's where the inside and the outside meets. Here's an image of the lymph nodes around your gastrointestinal system. And again, that makes sense because that's also a place where the inside and outside meets. But notice they aren't all there. Some of them are just in your arm. And you've probably noticed that. At some point you might have had a swollen lymph node in your armpit or something when you got sick, and that lymph node was busy fighting off an infection. So how does the lymph move? Again, to remind you, one-way valves, the same as with blood vessels, relying basically on lymphatic ducts, that's the term that's used, to return the lymph back to blood circulation. This is, by the way, one of the reasons that massages feel good. We talked about this before when we talked about regular vascular circulation, but lymph can kind of build up in vessels if you're not moving very much, and typically when you're sick, you're not moving very much, and so somebody massaging your back and working basically the lymph out of those vessels and back, into circulation can actually feel pretty good. So again, another reason why maybe therapeutic massage is good for other people than me. I ain't doing it. Okay, so that's the basics of the lymphatic system. But the next video really quickly will be just as quick and talk about problems that can happen with the lymphatic system.